Welcome, everyone. My name is Tare Udiowi, and welcome to this session. I am a master's student in intercultural and international communication in the School of Communication at Royal Roads University. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Royal Roads University is located on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. With gratitude, we live, work, and learn here, where the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. This session, I can assure you, is going to be a very exciting one. I want to welcome you to today's conference session titled The Art of an Ethical Ghost Story by our wonderful John Adams. When we hear the topic, the art of an ethical ghost story, a lot of things come to mind. I'm sure we have wondered, what is a ghost story? How do we tell an ethical ghost story? What do we owe to the past in our contemporary retelling of a ghost story? Because, hey, those who own the story are no longer with us. John, who holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and a Master in Museum Studies, is an expert on ghost storytelling, a historian and the author of 6 books, including Old Square Tales and His Lady, Ghosts and Legends of Bastion Square, and Chinese Victoria. He will tell us about the art of ghost storytelling, and he will draw from his experience in museum studies and historical research. But before we proceed, we will have 45 minutes in this session. John is going to tell us a lot about what he knows, and we hope to have time for questions in the end. I'll go off camera, but please, you can write your questions in the chat box, and I will come back on camera to ask John these questions. I will now turn you over to John.
Thank you, Terry. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm assuming that most of you are around here, but some of you are probably in distant places. So it may not be afternoon where you are. And Terry, thank you for the territorial acknowledgement. We always begin our tours with one. So since you have done that, I won't repeat it, but it is a very important aspect of presenting information to the public, and especially when we're doing ghost stories, which I've been doing now for close to 40 years. And I'm just going to present a little bit of background about myself, and then start in with some of the considerations that I have thought about, specifically for this presentation, but also which we deal with on a regular basis. So I have a company here in Victoria. It's called Discover the Past. And our slogan is, we do history tours by day and ghostly walks by night. We began the company about 25 years ago, but I have been doing tours for a long time. Not always ghost tours. And probably when I was a student, high school and university, I began to think for myself and began to wonder if there were such things as ghosts. I'd had a few encounters when I was a very young kid, but my parents said, "Oh, don't be so silly. There's no such thing as a ghost." Now, this was in the very early 1950s. My parents were both born in England. They came to Canada only a year and a half before I was born. So presumably their admonishment came from their own background, possibly from what their parents had told them. And to this day, I really don't know whether they believe in ghosts or not. I suspect they did. But it didn't really matter. They told me there was no such thing as a ghost. And so I began to assume there wasn't. Now, I had the good fortune yesterday morning to tune in when Elder Butch Dick was doing his keynote discussion. And one of the really interesting things he said that resonated with me Was that the trees are talking to us, listening? The rocks are talking to us, but we're not listening. The water is talking to us. In fact, everything around us is talking to us, but we just aren't listening. Are the ghosts talking to us? Well, my parents said, no, no, there are no such things as ghosts, so don't listen. And so I didn't. I programmed my little brain into thinking that there were no such things as ghosts. And so when I heard strange noises, when I saw things that I thought might be ghosts in my childhood, I just said, no, no, it must be something else. It must be a dream. But looking back, I think there's no doubt that probably I had experienced something. But one of the things that I came to grips with very early on is that believing in ghosts, having ghostly experiences is not very fashionable. In fact, it's downright bad in our society. Here in Victoria, I learned that very quickly when I was a young person. It just isn't fashionable. In fact, the idea of telling a ghost story at all, if we're looking for ethics, even telling a ghost story of any sort would not be ethical for various reasons. And those reasons might be based on religion. They might be based on place of origin. They might be based on lived experience. And also the fact that when we're telling a story about anybody, whether they're alive or dead, we really do have to be very, very careful. We do want to acknowledge that there are differences in all of us, and we do not want to do something that is going to antagonize or embarrass somebody else. Now, it's done all the time, obviously. People do often have disagreements. We just need to look at the news, and there are major disagreements all over the world. But I think probably most of us try to be careful what we say. And it's no different with ghost stories than it is with our daily lives. We have to be very careful what we say. Of course, if we look at ghost stories in the past, quite often they were very judgmental. They quite often had a moral to tell. And quite often the moral was um, looking at somebody who had a different idea, who had an experience, and it was actually belittling that person. Perhaps they're making fun of the fact that they had experienced a ghost, or perhaps even questioning their sanity. So we'll get into that a little bit more later on. I think probably most of us have heard ghost stories. Perhaps we enjoy telling ghost stories. And my own personal experiences came from being in Cubs and Scouts when I was a small boy and around the campfire. And some people were really, really good at telling the stories, of course. All the kids would get in close with the flickering firelight. And then all of a sudden, boom, somebody would jump out and everybody would scream and everybody would have a laugh. But for some kids, this would be very traumatizing. Now, they were stories. They were just stories to give kids a bit of a rise. But what about other ghost stories? What about the ghost stories that purport to be true? Now, when I thought about this topic, the ethics of telling ghost stories, I wondered, do they really intend me to talk about true ghost stories, if there are such a thing, or are these the fictional stories that are intended to be fictional and make no bones about the fact that they are? Well, I don't think it really matters. I think we have the same considerations, whether they're made up stories or whether they're stories that purport to be true. Let me just give you a little bit of more background about how I got into the business of telling ghost stories, in addition to history tours. Across the street from where I lived as a teenager was Ross Bay Cemetery, one of the very beautiful Victorian era cemeteries in Victoria. I probably had never really spent much time in a cemetery before until my family moved there in 1960. We came from Ontario. But I very quickly discovered that the cemetery was a fascinating place. I went to Sir James Douglas School. I found the grave of Sir James Douglas. I found the graves of many other people that I eventually found out about. And it became almost like a playground for me. I never thought very much about the dead people there because it was just such a wonderful place to walk through. I was filled with amazement at seeing the information. And then I moved away and came back and went back to Ross Bay Cemetery and saw it with new eyes, this time with a little bit more perspective as a historian. And I began to write a guidebook to the cemetery. Vandalism at Ross Bay Cemetery concerned me. It seemed to be ongoing in the 1980s, and so a group of us formed a small organization called the Old Cemeteries Society. And one of the ways we decided to encourage people to take an interest in preserving the cemetery and stopping vandalism was through walking tours. Now, many people said we were foolish for doing this, that people would make fun of us, that we were being ghoulish by taking groups into the cemetery. And I discovered at the time that there were many people here who were afraid of going into the cemetery. They weren't even sure they were allowed to go into the cemetery. Perhaps it was an underlying fear of ghosts or what might be lurking around. So we had that to contend with, and we decided from the very beginning that we would not be ghoulish. You know, we're not quite sure what we meant by ghoulish. We were not going to unduly talk about the macabre, about the ghosts, and that sort of thing. We were going to focus solely on the history, and we did. But after doing these tours for a number of years, we began them in the mid-1980s. At Halloween, people said, well, these history stories are very interesting, but it's Halloween. Tell us a ghost story. Well, I wasn't sure I really knew very many ghost stories associated with the people buried at Ross Bay, but in 1990, a man from Vancouver, Robert Bellick, published a book about ghost stories in British Columbia, and quite by chance, I got to meet him. And I asked him if he would do a tour at Ross Bay Cemetery based on some of the people in his book. We would show him where the graves were. And, well, at that time, we were receiving a good turnout on our tours. But for his tour in 1990, we had a huge number of people. There were probably close to 100 people, far more than we'd ever had before. And it wasn't just a flash in the pan because he said, I won't really be able to do these tours every year, but why don't you use the stories and tell them? The next year, we had even more people. And we're still telling ghost stories at Ross Bay Cemetery on the Sunday closest to Halloween in the daytime. And last year, we had almost 400 people. We had multiple guides. It has become the biggest single tour of the year. The rest of the year, we stick to history. You see, we didn't want to appear to be ghoulish. And we didn't want to be talking about ghosts for people that might be disinclined to talk about ghosts. So when I tell ghost stories, I'm aware that there are lots of people who do not believe in ghosts. And this is one of the major ethical considerations that we have to take. Okay, do we tell the ghost story or not? It depends on the audience. I think that's probably the same with any sort of presentation. You really need to know who your audience is. And so if there was an audience of people who were diametrically opposed for any reason to the subject of ghosts, then I don't think I would tell the story. Now, sometimes we don't know. There might be individuals in a group that do think that way. But if somebody asks me to do a tour for a group, I do like to find out something about them, and I often discourage them from taking a ghost tour if I know there might be a large proportion of people in the group who might not like the idea. So let's talk a little bit about that. Why wouldn't people like ghost stories? Well, for one thing, the religious beliefs might be very, very prevalent. The idea that when people die, their energy remains and somehow uh, becomes what we might generally term a ghost is a horrible idea for some people. For many, it's just something that happens. And in many cultures, it's what happens. But particularly in the last couple of centuries in the Western in countries where the Protestant religions have taken hold, it's something that sometimes doesn't resonate very well with people because the belief is that if you see something that is a ghost, then that isn't good. It's probably the work of the devil. The devil is manifesting his presence in the form of a ghost trying to lure you in. And then suddenly you're stuck. So many religions, especially some Protestant religions, believe that if you deal with ghosts, you're dealing really, literally with the devil. The only true ghost is the Holy Ghost. Now, that is not necessarily the entire belief of Christianity. There are many Christians who truly do believe in ghosts. But if we're dealing with a group of people that are of the mind that ghosts are the work of the devil, then I don't think I would want to tell them ghost stories. It might upset them, and it would probably start a dialogue that it would be unpleasant. Let me just tell you I think it's a humorous story. I was in Bastion Square, one of the very haunted areas of Victoria, one dark night with a large group in front of me. And I was telling the ghost story about the old courthouse, very old Supreme Court building in Bastion Square. Hangings had taken place on the site. The bodies were buried underneath, and there were lots of other ghosts inside as well. And we were talking about this when a couple walked up to the edge of the group. And whenever people are doing a tour outdoors, inevitably a few people might eavesdrop, and that's fine. We don't mind for a few stories. And very rarely do people interrupt or become bothersome. But in that case, a young man stepped forward. He was probably in his 20s. Didn't know who he was, but he jumped up onto a little step where I was standing, and he opened up his arms and he said, "Don't listen to him. This is the work of the devil. He's speaking nonsense." And he said, "The only true ghost is the Holy Ghost," or something to that effect. And he went on in this vein. And what do? We just let these people talk it out, and then hopefully they will get fed up and move on. There's not much you can do when somebody does interrupt a tour like that. However, as I was standing there just waiting for him to move on, another person from the group jumped up beside him and said, "We didn't come here to hear about Jesus Christ. We came here to find about ghosts. Now get the," and there was a very well-known expletive, "Get out of here." And the guy's girlfriend was so mortified. She was obviously trying to get him out of there, and they slunk off. And it's a good example. The people on the tour were there to hear ghost stories. They weren't to hear his version of whether they existed or not. But we have to be very, very careful. I mentioned that my parents were from England. I consider myself fully Canadian, and things English don't really interest me more than things from other places. But nonetheless, I have been to England a number of times, and I think most of you will know that if you go to a place like England, there are ghosts around every corner, whether it's a haunted house, a castle, the pub, there are ghosts everywhere, and they talk about them a lot, and it's part of their folklore. So I thought I would, looking for ethics, I would give two examples, and one is a house in Liverpool. It's a National Trust house. It's called Speak Hall. Beautiful, beautiful Tudor style house. And some cousins of mine from that area knew I was interested in ghosts, and they had been there before but wanted to see it again. So they took me. And what they didn't tell me was there were well-known ghosts there. It was a quiet day. The woman who was showing us around, when my cousin said, "Oh, by the way, my cousin from Canada is here and he's really interested in ghosts. I hear you have ghosts here." She perked up and she said, "Oh, yes." And I thought she did it very, very well. First of all, she said, "Fact." And she talked about a person whose room it was we were in, what her name was, what she did, and the fact that she had actually died. A well-documented event. Fact. A legend. And she talked about the fact that people saw the woman's ghost, or a ghost that possibly was her, in that room, and described her, a woman in gray. And so it was all through the house. She went on in that vein. Fact, and gave us the true history of the place as far as she knew it. And then legend. She didn't debunk the legends. She simply said that they were the stories that were told about the ghosts. Were they true? Well, who knows for sure. And I really don't know whether she believed them or not. But that was a good way to do it. Not dismissing the idea. There are some historic sites, and I think Craigdarroch Castle here in Victoria is one place that many people believe is haunted. But if you go there and say to one of the guides, is this place haunted? They will stop you and say, no, 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 it's not haunted at all. And just have a look at this beautiful room and try to divert you. Because although they probably know there are many stories, some of them well-founded, they don't want people to go there and do ghost hunting. Other historic sites, however, are quite okay with doing that. Hatley Castle at Royal Roads University is one of them. I have been part of a group that has gone there to do ghost hunting in the evening, and nobody seems to mind. There's a place in Brighton, in England, called Preston Hall, or Preston Manor. And Preston Manor is a well-known haunted building. And just last year, they developed a code of ethics. And in preparation for this, I thought, well, I've got to go and find out what some of the other ethical considerations are that other people have thought about in telling ghost stories. And this was the only one I could find that was based on a museum. The one from Speak Hall was obviously unwritten. But let me just read this out. First of all, they divide the idea of ethics into several categories. One is institutional integrity. And this involves proactively championing the ethical behavior regarding the subject of ghosts and the paranormal, acting in stewardship of the ghost stories bequeathed to the people of the city of Brighton. Very interesting concept that these were a bequest. The stories were a bequest. And so on. And to safeguard the reputation of Preston Manor through material made public by any media, either by presenting it in a tour, a pamphlet, a television show, or whatever. The next category is public engagement. And I'll just read out some of the salient points here. To provide public access to our ghost stories and operate in a rational and logical manner. To protect the vulnerable. Never present material that is dishonest, trivial, or unscrupulous, avoiding the validation of pseudoscience, while remaining mindful of alternative viewpoints and the strongly held beliefs of others. So don't stop telling ghost stories, but just be very mindful of what other people might believe or not believe. Avoid language that is inappropriate, offensive, and unclear while telling stories and presenting material that is engaging, thought-provoking, and sometimes frightening. We'll come back to that in a moment. And scrupulously risk assess public events and continually update our records. And the final category I'll talk about is people. Ensure people employed or contracted to undertake work within our historic properties are unperturbed by paranormal reputation. So they need to know. You have to disclose the fact that the place is haunted, that the place has a haunted reputation, and is this going to bother them to work in such an environment? Never ask staff to undertake work relating to the paranormal if they are uncomfortable doing so because of their cultural, religious, professional views, or personal opinions and beliefs. Ensure that staff are protected and informed regarding confidential data disclosed to them during paranormal public events and activities in accordance with the Data Protection Act of 2018. So when we're doing ghost stories, or occasionally I don't get involved in too many ghost investigations, but occasionally I have been involved in some, and quite possibly somebody is going to say something of a personal experience that they've had. And the Preston Manor really encourages people to keep that material confidential. And finally, ensure that staff are trained to present material and answer questions relating to the paranormal with competence and confidence. So rather than just saying, oh, I don't know, we'll look it up, being able to engage people in a rational conversation about their interests, their concerns, and so on, and not brush it off as something that is inappropriate to talk about. So we do have many different things that we look at when we're dealing with ghosts. But one of the things to consider is where people live, what their backgrounds are. And although in North America, about 50% of people do believe in ghosts, and the other half presumably either don't or aren't quite sure, in some cultures, the proportion of people who do believe in ghosts is very, very high. And if we're dealing with people who have one belief system or another, we do have to take that into account. Quite often on our tours, which we conduct throughout the year in Victoria, by way of introduction, I often do say that here in Victoria, we are the most haunted city in British Columbia. Is it? Well, we honestly believe we have more ghost stories collected here than any other city in the province. But I think if you go to any ghost tour, they will claim that they are the most haunted place in their area. But I do like to set the tone and say, not everybody believes in ghosts. It's about half the population in Canada. And if you do believe in ghosts, that's great. Welcome. And just listen to the stories. They might resonate with you. Um, if you don't believe in ghosts, that's fine too. Just listen to them as stories, just as if you were listening to a movie or you were reading a novel about a ghost. So just enjoy them for their entertainment value. We don't ask people to identify one way or another. But in North America, there are huge numbers of TV shows. Um, there are many places, restaurants and businesses that play up their ghostly theme. And for some people, this is not a good idea. This is ethically inappropriate because it's assumed that the people who are interested in those things are gullible, that really only gullible people would be interested in ghosts. That's not the case. There are lots of highly intelligent people who believe in ghosts. And depending on one's place of origin, think of China, traditional China, where when somebody lived, they looked after their parents. Filial piety was a very important aspect of the Confucian belief, Confucian philosophy. But when parents die, they don't go away. They remain, their spirit remains. And it's the duty, usually, traditionally, of the oldest son to make sure that the grave is properly chosen so that the feng shui, the forces of nature, will allow the dead to rest in peace. But the dead aren't just in one location, the spirit splits up, and part of the spirit should reside in the home where they had lived. And the family want them to be there because if they aren't there and they're not provided for with food, money, and clothing, just as the living need those things, then they become hungry, angry ghosts and wander, playing havoc with everybody. So traditionally in China, the belief was very strong that you had to look after your ancestors because they were there whether you wanted them to or not. Think of Mexico, the Day of the Dead. Now, these days, I'm sure, even in China, through the Cultural Revolution, there have been many changes. There are lots of people in China who no longer um, follow the old idea of filial piety or looking after the parents when they're alive or dead. But in Mexico, the Day of the Dead is well known. Typically, the idea is at All Hallows Eve, Halloween, the curtain that separates the land of the living from the land of the dead rises up, and the dead can move freely into our realm. It's an old belief from the Celtic world. And, well, that's fine. But not everybody wants them there. And so, in some places, people put on scary masks. They lit fires, made noises to scare the spirits back to the other side. So, when the curtain fell again, they would be where they belonged. In Mexico, they accept the fact the curtain will rise up, and on All Hallows Eve, the dead will arrive in your home. And you're not going to drive them away right away. You're going to make them feel welcome. There will be a meal, their favorite food, maybe a bit of tequila, cigarettes if they smoked. And then later in the evening, usually one of the older women will start leading the ghosts back to the cemetery. And they will sit and put some food and light some candles and be there while the dead settle back into their graves. And I had another experience on one of my tours. One of my daughter's uh, friends had a boyfriend from Mexico, and he came to one of our tours around Halloween. And he said to his girlfriend, he was just here for a while, from what he's saying, it sounds as though there are people here who don't believe in ghosts. And she said, you're right, lots of people don't. And for him, that was unusual because everybody in his household believed in ghosts, and, well, Granny especially. It was just accepted. So, so many different things to talk about, but we do have to be very careful to follow the ideas of privacy, to make sure that we are ethical when we're telling stories about anybody, and not to knowingly antagonize people, to diminish their own beliefs, or to make fun of them. And let's face it, there were many stories told in the past that mocked people who experienced things. We can tell those stories, but we don't necessarily need to tell the stories about how those people were embarrassed in their own situations. A good ghost story is going to resonate no matter who experiences it. So I see that we're actually beyond our 30 minutes, and we do want time for questions for sure.
Yeah. Thank you
So I'm
so
going
very
to
much.
turn it back to Terry.
Yeah, thank you so very much, John, for all that wonderful information. We actually have wonderful comments here. Someone was asking, Natasha asked about the guidelines you were speaking of, but of course you've mentioned them. So we're going to go to the next question by Wendy Seskos James. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. So in summary, Wendy wants to know if you have thought of pursuing developing a code of ethics for Victoria, Canada's most haunted city. Have
So do
you?
you have a code of ethics specifically for Victoria?
Yes.
No, we don't. Um, and probably if there was one, it would be me, or there are other people as well who are involved in this sort of thing. But we don't have one that's specific to Victoria.
Okay. Another question. Megan Reimer. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So Megan Reimer wants to know what she says. They say, what does one consider pseudoscience, and how do we exclude it from a ghost story?
Good point. I think pseudoscience is, we can probably all recognize it, information that is deliberately skewed or has not been properly evaluated, uh, typically by people who are biased one way or another. And within ghost hunting these days, there is a lot of use of scientific material, scientific instruments. In the old days, people just felt ghosts themselves. By the way, we can see them, we can smell them, we can hear them, we can feel them. And in the old days, many people just experienced this through their own senses. Perhaps a divining rod or a pendulum or something like that might enhance their ability to experience the ghosts. But these days, people have electronic equipment, digital equipment, cameras of all sorts, some very sophisticated stuff. And I think that's probably, in a way, what the pseudoscience might involve. Scientific apparatus being used to look for ghosts, but whether it's properly calibrated, whether people are following proper experimental procedures, often they're not. And so these sorts of things come across as being based on science, but they may not be. So that's one aspect of pseudoscience. How do we exclude it from a ghost story? It's probably not going to be easy because it's all around us in huge amounts.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, John. I have a question here that says, how do we learn from ghost stories and apply them today?
Good question. I think at one time a lot of ghost stories were based on moral principles. And so somebody did something bad in their lifetime. They've come back to relive that and to make amends. It's often said that ghosts come back to finish unfinished business. And so if you were intending to do something but didn't, you're going to come back and maybe you'll have a second chance. It's kind of like purgatory in a way. In Christian beliefs, Catholic beliefs have changed over the years. At one time, there was heaven or hell, but kind of there's an in-between spot called purgatory, which has also changed. If you're really, really bad, you'd probably go straight to hell. But what if you were just a little bit bad? Well, you might not go straight to heaven. You might end up in purgatory, where you do some things, and on the day of judgment, perhaps if people have prayed enough for you and so on, then you might have a second chance. So I think, how do we learn from ghost stories? Quite often, if the ghosts have come back to make amends, then I think the morals are fairly obvious. But not all ghost stories actually do have the idea of trying to improve people. Some of them are just good stories, but often they might in some ways, just like a good novel. A novel doesn't necessarily have to have a strong moral message or a strong message to impart, but sometimes they do. And if you're telling a story about anybody, whether they're living or whether they have come back as a ghost, um, there's really, in my mind, not very much difference. But sometimes I think a lot of people are interested in ghost stories, and so especially for young people, the idea of a ghost or something a little different is going to hook them into a story rather than something which um, might seem old-fashioned. And I was going to use the word paranormal, but that's a very difficult word to use because what some of us consider normal, somebody else is going to consider paranormal or beyond normal. And so if you see a ghost and the next person doesn't, is that paranormal? No, because uh, perhaps that other person considers not believing in ghosts or not seeing ghosts to be paranormal. So now,
Thank you very much for
what
that.
I see one of the other questions here. What are the ethics of
Yeah.
the origins of the ghost stories you tell?
Yeah.
Permissions, copyright, etc. Good question for sure. A lot of my stories have come from newspapers of old, back in the 1800s. Some of them are in the realm of urban legends that have been around for a long time. We'll never know for sure exactly where they come from. Some of them we can document. Um, Quite often, there's stories that have been told to me or one of my other guides personally. And generally, when somebody tells me a story, I always ask, okay, do you mind if I repeat this story? And more often than not, the people are saying, oh, no, no, go ahead. Well, what's the address? And they tell me the address. In some cases, people will say, yeah, I'll tell you the story, but I'd really prefer that you not give my address. Uh, you can say that I live in Oak Bay or whatever community it might be. That's close enough. That's fine. So we often do ask permission for that, but copyright, this is very, very difficult. If you write down a ghost story in a book, as I have, and then you've got automatic copyright in that. If I'm out on the street telling a ghost story and somebody just happens to listen to it, and it's my story, but what if somebody else decides to use it? And sometimes they do. So just a small example. Um, People do tell me stories. I've collected hundreds of them over the years. Some of them are big stories and some are just tiny things. I put them away, and sometimes small stories do eventually add up into a bigger story. But um, I'm aware that nobody else has had that story told them. I do the research. I try to figure out who it might be, logically who it might be, why the ghost might be coming back, and if there's some other logical reason for somebody having experienced something they think might be a ghost. And so, in a way, it's the person's story that told it to me. But as I redevelop it and work it up, it also becomes mine in some ways. And I know because some of those stories are ones that nobody else knows. And then I read somebody else's book or article and hear exactly the same story. Of course, no author is going to enjoy that sort of thing. It happens. Um, Now, somebody is asking, I can't tell, or perhaps I missed it. Do you believe in ghosts, or have you a personal ghost story?
Yeah.
Good question too. Um, and I sometimes come back with saying, are you going to ask the priest if he believes in God? Some do.
Yeah.
There are some who don't. Are they going to tell you? Are you going to ask? And so, to be honest, I would like to be skeptical, for sure. I have an open mind. But at one time, I would have never thought I would be telling ghost stories, that I probably took to heart what my parents said. No, there's no such thing as ghost stories. No such thing as ghosts. But I've had enough experiences now and heard so many other um, people's personal accounts that I do believe there is something there. What it is exactly, I don't know. And a personal ghost story, well, this is one that is, I'm trying to figure out the year. It was probably 1951, maybe 1952. I was just a little kid. I was actually still in a crib at the time. And an aunt of mine came from England, and my brother had another room in the house. He was older than I was. And so I had to move in with him. They moved my cot, my crib, into his room. I was on one side, he was on the other. And this was prior to our family having a TV. I didn't even know what a TV was. And one morning I woke up and I was wide awake. And there on the wall, just that far away from my head, there was a man appearing, just like, well, we see faces of people on the screen right now. It was just like that, just like a TV picture, except I didn't know what a TV was. And I looked at him, and I don't think he said anything. He just was there. His mouth was opening. And my brother, I said, hey, Brian, who is this guy? And he said, oh, did you see him too? He's there all the time. Don't worry, but don't tell mom and dad. Of course, I was about 2, and I blabbed, and they said, oh, don't be so silly. There's no such thing as a ghost. And anyway, I don't think I saw him again. Now, my brother and I we were on good terms our whole lives. He died a couple of years ago, but just before he died, he actually came down to Victoria for a visit. And I said, hey, Brian, and we were talking about all sorts of memories. And I said, do you remember the time? Well, he did not remember my being in the room. I was just a little kid brother. I was just in the way. But he did remember having seen that ghost of the man in the wall. It was really, it made the hair bristle on the back of my neck, because I knew, 70 years later, we discovered that we'd had exactly the same experiences. And he was a down to earth person. He was not one to believe in this kind of stuff, or so he said. So that's one very small personal story.
Okay. So Sarah Nelson asks if you have a favorite ghost story.
I do actually. And maybe I don't know if we're running out of time, but anyway, I'll go on as
Oh, we
long as
have
you.
about 3 minutes left.
Sure. Okay. So this is a story that actually is an old one from British Columbia, and it's a story that has that resonates with many people. It involves a barber up in Barkerville named Wellington Moses, and Moses had a barber shop up there. He'd lived in Victoria. He came down to the coast and was heading back to Barkerville, and he fell in company with a couple of other guys. James Barry and Morgan Blessing. Morgan Blessing pulled out a gold nugget one night in the shape of a skull. They were by the campfire. And anyway, he said it was his good luck charm. It was quite a valuable piece. And he tucked it away. Moses continued on, and the others followed. When Moses got back to Barkerville, he saw James Barry, but wondered where Morgan Blessing was. No, said James Barry. He decided to turn around and go back. Fine. Well, Wellington Moses was in his barber shop. And who should walk into the shop but the missing man, Morgan Blessing, looking a bit the worse for wear. And Moses was not sure about this. The man sat down, motioned that he wanted to shave. In those days, you put a hot towel around the customer's face, and then Moses turned to strop his straight razor. And when he turned back to the chair, there was nobody there. He ran out to the street. There was nobody there. The man had simply disappeared. He got back to the barber chair, and there was the towel, soaked in blood. He kept this to himself. And then a couple of days later, one of the dance hall girls came into the shop and said, oh, look at this. It was the gold nugget. Where did you get that? Oh, that nice Mr. Barry gave it to me in the dance hall last night. And Wellington Moses knew right away, okay, this guy, James Barrie, knows something about what happened to Morgan Blessing. How did he get that gold nugget? And then, shortly afterwards, when a man came running into the camp, claiming that he'd found the body of Morgan Blessing, the missing man, beside the trail, well, Moses went straight to the sheriff and said, "You got to get James Barrie. He's the one." But Barrie had got on a stagecoach and headed south. But there was a telegram. In those days, a telegraph had just been installed. They telegraphed down the line, and James Barrie was arrested when he stepped off the stagecoach at Yale, escorted back to Barkerville, and the Chief Justice, Sir Matthew Bailey Begbie, the next time he was in that area, heard the case, and James Barrie was found guilty and was hanged for the murder of Morgan Blessing. And in his bench book, in the BC archives, Sir Matthew Bailey Begbie sketched that skull. However, he did not mention the fact that Wellington Moses had seen the ghost of Morgan Blessing. But the story was told many, many ways by many people. It was popularized by a man named David Higgins, who did sometimes embellish his stories. Was this the case of a ghost being involved in helping solve a murder? We'll never know for sure. That's one of my favorite stories.
Thank you so very much, John. That was very beautiful. Thank you for all the wonderful information you have shared with us. Thank you for taking time to do this. And I thank everyone for participating, asking questions, and attending this session.